So in my last materials video, it took me forever to record the introductory part. Just me saying my name and saying hello must have taken me about 20 different takes. Hopefully this time I'm going to do a little bit better job of it, a little bit faster. This video is going to be about toning paper. It's going to be about the materials I use when I'm toning paper. So inks and powders and pigments and different kinds of tape. And hopefully I can get the video done in under 45 minutes. We'll see. I'm going to keep my fingers crossed. I'm going to make a combination in this video, and that is going to be talking about some of the papers that I use to draw on, and also some of the ways that I tone those papers as a preparation for drawing. Most of these papers are available in the US. There's only one, in fact, that I would say that you're going to have to source elsewhere, and I'll get to that when the time comes. They're mostly in a series of different whites. You might find that if you follow my Instagram, you've seen maybe some drawings on gray paper where I've used white chalk to kind of heighten a little bit the highlights in the drawing. And I don't mind doing that. I kind of think it's an interesting effect sometimes, but I also find that my preference leans much more towards just drawing on a white paper where the white of the paper tends to be the light in the drawing, rather than to have to create that light with either a white chalk or gouache. But without talking about that too much now, let's go into maybe some of the papers that I use. And I'll start out with one that I've actually started using recently, or started using again recently. And that's the Stonehenge paper manufactured by a company called Legion. And I've got two colors of that here, one white and one, as they call it, natural, which is kind of an off-white, kind of cream color, a little bit warmer, a little bit yellower than what you find in the sort of pure white. A lot more like some of the other fairly kind of standard colors that you find, like if you compare it to the Strathmore 400 series paper that I think is fairly kind of universally used. You see it really everywhere in the different art schools that I visit. The Stonehenge paper kind of, this one at least mirrors a little bit more that color. Now, the Stonehenge paper I used to use when I was a student in Florence, and I used it instead of the Canson Meton paper that was kind of recommended at the time, just because I felt like it had a little bit less tooth to it. It was a little bit easier to get an even value on. And while I still find that to be true, I think that there's things that I like about it and things that I feel maybe a little bit ambivalent towards. With the Stonehenge paper, because of the actual makeup or the constitution of the paper itself, I don't feel too comfortable like toning it with what would be called like an aqueous dispersion, or say a pigment suspended in water. I mean, I suppose that you could tone it with ink or with an aqueous dispersion. But again, it's just that this paper doesn't have the feeling of having a whole lot of glue kind of binding it together. And so I would worry a little bit about putting too much water onto it, how that would affect the fibers of the paper. That being said, for dry toning, which I'll discuss a little bit later, I think it's really, really excellent. It also, I find, gives you an opportunity for really kind of beautiful line work. The way that you're able to kind of blend the graphite into the paper along a contour, I think is really exceptionally nice. And it also has this, these are sort of cut strips, but when you get the paper initially, it has this really nice kind of deckled edge, I guess you'd call it. But that comes from I assume when the paper is put onto the screens that they use to make it. But a really nice, attractive surface to paint on. It comes in a lot of different varieties of colors as well. So if you do like working with white chalk, they have a really beautiful kind of tobacco colored paper or color that they offer this paper in, that I think is really nice for that. A nice kind of warm undertone that interacts well with the kind of cool white chalk that you might put on top of it. So if you like working that way, I would definitely investigate their website and just take a look at some of the different colors that they offer. I want to move on though to the next paper, if I can get these out of the way. And that's one that I find is a really good sort of all-purpose paper. And that is the Canson, it's spelled this way. My understanding, or at least the times that I have heard it pronounced, it has been pronounced Meton. I believe that it is a French origin to the name here. But the manufacturer is a company called Canson. The make of the paper is called Meton, spelled M-I-T-I-E-N-T-E-S. It's available also in rolls, so you can get a really, really huge piece of this if you want to. So for working on larger projects, I think it's actually really interesting. And it's a very substantial paper actually for how thin it is. If you've ever used a lot of different kind of watercolor papers, you might find that you've used like a 300-pound paper, right? Or one of these really kind of thick cardboardy papers that are made for like sustaining like a lot of sort of water and washes put over it. And while this Canson is much more like a kind of 140-pound paper, I do find that it stands up really well to a lot of kind of mixed media work if you've stretched it well, which is something also that I'll discuss or show in a video a little bit later, is how to sort of adhere your loose papers to a board so that when you do sort of wash ink or other dispersions over them, that they go back to this nice taut and flat surface. So the Canson Meton, which also comes in a great variety of colors, I think is a really good utility paper. If I was to maybe balance out a little bit my opinion of it, I would say that the reason I don't use it for everything is it actually is a little bit toothier. So I feel like some of the smoothness of transition that you're able to get more easily on Stonehenge is not as easily attainable on Canson. It's not to say that you can't get it, just that maybe there's a little bit more effort put into that part of it. But if you're working a lot larger of a piece, like say you're doing maybe a life-size portrait, for instance, I think that little bit of tooth actually kind of helps you in terms of like letting a little bit of air come through some of the hatch work. So that's Canson Meton. The next one is a paper that actually just started using, and just on a whim, I was working with my anatomy students actually earlier this week, and there was a pad of this paper out. I'd never actually used it because I find it seems very insubstantial. The paper itself feels so thin that, and it also dents very easily. So if you kind of carry your large sheet of paper not carefully, you can get those kind of dents in the paper that really, for fine art purposes, if you're making a finished artwork, you can't have like little divots or dents or wrinkles in the paper. It has to be, in some sense, fairly pristine. So I was worried about that with the Strathmore. After having drawn on it a little bit, I found that the effects that I was able to get using the brushes and stumps and things that I used to manipulate my graphite, I was really able to get a wide range of effects, and I was really excited about it. So I think actually the next video that I make for my Patreon page, I'm going to draw on this Strathmore 400 series paper. I also just ordered recently, they make a thicker, I think it's a 300-pound version of this 400 series medium surface. So I'm waiting on that in the mail. I'm looking forward to, if it's a little bit, quite a bit of a thicker paper that's harder to dent and easier to kind of take care of. This might take a jump up the rankings in terms of my appreciation for it. So the Strathmore 400 series medium surface. This is the only of the Strathmore 400 series that I've used. They have a smoother version, I think probably a rougher version. I haven't used either one of those, but I can recommend this one for sure. But again, remember that it's a little bit more of a kind of fragile paper. So if you're not careful in handling your paper, or you're a little bit more rigorous in your treatment of paper, maybe this one isn't the one for you. But if you're a little bit more careful, the effects that you can get with it, I think, are really, really nice. The last one is a paper that I initially started using when I was living in Sweden, and it's a Danish manufacturer. If you've ever been to a workshop with me, you'll know that I used to hand this paper out at my workshops, just as I feel like the surface of it for so long was so superior for graphite handling. The other reason that I used to hand it out is it's not available worldwide. You really have to be in Scandinavia in order to be able to purchase this. The only way that I'm able to get it in the States is actually that I purchase it from a shop in Sweden who has an agreement with a wholesaler. So they're able to kind of purchase amounts of it, and then I get a friend of mine who lives in Gothenburg in Sweden still to walk it from the art supply store down to the shipping company and send it over to the United States to me at very great expense. But I really like the paper, and so I have imported it over the last couple of years. That being said, it is possible to purchase it through this shop in Sweden that I will mention in the post that goes up on my Patreon page in relationship to this. The paper itself is it's almost more of what I would call kind of a craft paper, though it is archival, which is to say it's pH neutral, and you're not going to expect any yellowing or damage to the paper to occur just through its composition. It's not one of these, it's not like an Arches paper or something that is like curated for fine art purposes. I get the feeling that this is a paper that they don't advertise in exactly that kind of realm. Though I've found its application for pencil drawing, graphite, right, or charcoal drawing, in specific compressed charcoal, like a General's charcoal, rather than like say a Nitram charcoal. I think it has really excellent effects. A lot of the drawings that you've seen of mine online, a lot of the drawings that I've posted images of on Patreon or Instagram are made on this Danish paper. I really highly recommend it if you can get a hold of it. If you live in Europe, it would probably be a little bit easier. If you live in the States, probably a little bit more challenging. But it's still possible to get. And I will put up, like I said, the contact information to the shop where I get it from. And if you're able to call them, most Swedish people, and including all the people in this shop, speak very good English, so there's not really any difficulty in communicating with them and trying to work out a way to get a shipment of this paper to you. So that's the Playcut. It's a Danish manufacturer. I've been in contact actually with the factory that produces this paper, but they won't sell direct orders of less than like, I think it's about 1,300 euro. So you're talking like a kind of almost a pallet of paper, which would be great to invest in, but I simply can't go through that much of it in a few years' time to make it sort of reasonable to buy that much. So that's another interesting one. I can go on now a little bit to some of the materials that I'm going to use when toning the paper a little bit later on in this video. And there's two sort of dry mediums that I'm going to use, both made by Cretacolor, and I have a sanguine powder and a graphite powder. The difference in between these two in terms of how they react to the paper, of course it is situational. Using them on different papers, say using them on the Strathmore versus the Stonehenge, they're going to embed into the paper a little bit differently. But I will say that my general experience is that with the sanguine toning, I feel like the granule size of the sanguine might be a little bit smaller than the granule size of the graphite powder, and so it tends to embed a little bit more deeply in the fibers of the paper. meaning that it's a little bit more difficult to erase away to kind of a perfect white, or at least to the value of the paper that was left behind. This isn't altogether a bad thing. I actually find that it adds like a nice kind of even modeling to the area around the highlights, so that you don't get these sort of hard etched out kind of shapes around your highlights. So interesting for that if you want to have a more sort of colorful effect in your drawings. And the graphite powder, of course, if you're drawing in graphite, there's no conflict between this and subsequent layers of drawing that go on top of it. I'll probably also do at least one dispersion of this graphite in water, and also tone the paper with that, and you can see a little bit the effect that comes from that. Then onto the inks. I've got here two different brands. One's a Winsor & Newton calligraphy ink, and the other is made by a company called Higgins. Either of these inks are rather permanent and I think pretty useful when dispersing in water. I personally just tend to prefer the Higgins, only because it seems like the composition of the ink disperses a little bit more easily into water for whatever reason. So between these two brands, I tend to kind of prefer the Higgins. They also make like a series, Higgins that is, also makes a series, broad range of different colors of ink that's made for kind of toning paper. So you can get like sort of magenta, I'm sure you can get something like cyan. They make an incredible range of these. So if you're also looking to get a little bit creative in terms of how you deal with color in your undertones for your drawings, they're a great company to kind of facilitate that. I also have here something that I very rarely use, but I have used in the past if I find that I have a really nice large sheet of paper and I've toned it a little bit too dark, or some of the effects that I were getting have a little bit too much contrast. I've actually mixed in a bit of white ink into some of my ink washes in order to like even out a little bit the value across the paper, or to heighten a little bit. Instead, if I got a little bit too dark, I can get a little bit lighter. I wouldn't highly recommend this, or at least I would say test it out on a less consequential sheet of paper. Maybe if you have like a 4 foot by 5 foot sheet of paper, it's not the place to like test out playing with a white ink, because I do find that it does create a little bit of a different surface to the paper. Whether it's whatever kind of sort of glycerin or binder that they're using in this ink, creates a little bit slicker of a surface, and so it's a little bit harder to kind of dig your kind of values into, I find. So interesting to use, but with a little bit of caution as well. As far as like applying these washes to the paper, I've just got my Royal & Langnickel Zen. I think it's called like a pointed filbert brush. And you can really use any watercolor brush. These are the ones that I happen to use, so I thought I'd show that as well. And then when you're going to adhere your paper to a board, it's important, I think, not to use something like a masking tape, especially if you're using like one of these thinner papers like the Strathmore or Stonehenge, whatever it is, which are kind of 140 pound rather than like the 300 pound paper that is more like a cardboard. You could probably just use masking tape to put that onto the board. This gummed paper tape is useful because it's sort of water activated, like I think like a postage stamp, right? Or like postage stamps used to be when you'd have to lick them. But you sort of wet this, apply it to the edge of your paper so that the paper itself becomes kind of like a drum, right? So it's sealed in a way somewhat permanently to the edge, rather where with masking tape you could just tear away that masking tape. So you have this more permanent seal of the paper to the board, which means that when you wash water over that paper and it buckles as the fibers are like expanding, the edges are going to be held true to where they were, so that when that paper dries out and the fibers shrink again, that paper goes back to its sort of perfectly flat state. Otherwise, you're going to be left with a kind of buckled surface. That's why I use this. Also, I've got my little cup here that I use for my sort of graphite dispersions. This will never be cycled back into kitchen use. So I've never done this on camera before. Hopefully I can make it work as smoothly as possible. I'll tell you what I've got. I have a small piece of sponge that I've cut out and I keep exclusively for this purpose. I have a small dish of just regular tap water. And I've also pre-torn some lengths of gummed paper tape that are equivalent to what I'll need to sort of tape down this piece of paper. I'm going to flip the gummed paper tape over to the side that's been coated with this water activated glue. I dip my sponge a little bit into the tap water. It doesn't need to be soaked through with it. It's just enough that you can get an even coating of water along this paper. As much as possible, you'd like to get it wet in one pass so you don't start pulling up the glue onto your sponge. But it does have to be pretty moist indeed. Now, the paper tape is going to start reacting to that by kind of curling over. So you do want to get it onto your paper fairly quickly. But after that, I like to kind of just rub down the length of it and make sure that I've got a good adhesion of that gummed paper tape to both the board and the paper. If your tape isn't wet enough, you can find that either there will be some separation between the paper and the tape that will occur, and when you press it down, maybe you will find that it comes back up, or that the curling of the paper reacts more strongly than the adhesion of the glue. So try to make sure that you get it just moist enough. You'll have to probably practice a few times. There will be some moments where you have made the tape not quite wet enough. Here I think I got a pretty good adhesion going, but I'm paranoid about these things because I've seen it not work well so many times that I like to kind of keep rubbing over it quite a few times before I'll be satisfied that I have an adhesion that is going to sort of stay true. The next thing that you want to do is to just go side by side. Also, if you're using a kind of thinner paper, like maybe that Strathmore paper, you might find that the paper itself actually starts reacting to the moisture that's going on along the edges of it. Don't worry about that. Just continue on your way. You also could, if you wanted to, place a book or something heavy over the side of it, which will just make sure that there's not any kind of separation between the tape and the paper or the tape and the board to kind of maintain the adhesion. I have a slightly thicker paper here. This is actually an Arches paper, so it's a little bit heavier. It's what I had around the studio to use. In this situation, we don't have that problem. If you do find that your paper buckles a little bit, again, just stay true to the path, just keep going, and I think you'll be just fine. But I'm going to go on to the next side here and do the same thing again. So now that we have this all set up, I've got to let it dry and make sure that the paper tape has adhered fully to the board and to the paper. A good signifier of that is usually when you see water like this has sufficiently evaporated, and that gummed adhesive has gone back to its non-wet state. So that's going to be maybe 15 minutes or so, maybe 20 minutes, and we'll come back and actually work on a little bit of the toning of the paper. So my gummed paper tape is dry. I have a pretty solid adhesion that I can check at the edges of the tape on the paper. So I feel confident that if I re-wet this area, I'm not going to lose the adhesion of the tape to the paper, which is very important. Something I thought I should also mention about the Canson Meton paper that we discussed earlier. It is a paper that's two-sided. So you have a kind of a rougher, almost kind of golf ball texture to one side of it. The side that I use for drawing is the opposite side. I have known people to use the rougher side, but for me, the patterning of the texture is a little bit more machined than I like. It's not a very organic texture. It's sort of fairly uniform in its patterning, and I think it kind of makes an effect on the drawing that I don't like as much. So I use the smoother side of the Canson paper. I also have this here in this part of the video so that I have a kind of a test sheet so that when I mix up my graphite dispersion and also my sort of ink dispersion, that I can test those before I kind of tone my paper with it, right? And I'll be getting onto that in just a moment. So I've got here just a jar of distilled water for my ink dispersion, and I have my disgusting graphite cup for my graphite dispersion, and I have a bottle of water that I'm going to eventually add to that graphite cup in order to make the mixture I'll tone this paper with. I'm going to do a half and half. So I'll do one half in ink, I'll do one half in graphite. I should probably let them dry in between so that there's not like any bleed over in between the two. And then we'll do like a little erasure test so you can see maybe how the ink tones a little bit more permanently and the graphite is able to be kind of removed from the surface a little bit more, or quite a bit more actually. So I'm going to start, I think, with the ink dispersion. So open up my jar of water and just want to make sure that I'm doing this in the right spot so you can see it on camera. Okay. So I've got my Higgins ink. By the way, don't open it over the paper. I'm probably going to be doing this a lot more close to the paper that I'm going to be using than I normally would, just because I don't like any sort of accidents to happen on the paper that I'm eventually going to make a drawing on top of. And the nice thing also about the Higgins ink is that it comes with this little eyedropper made into the bottle itself. So I'm just going to drop a few drops of this into my jar, set it aside, and now I have an ink dispersion that I can test on my Canson paper just to see if it's sort of dark enough. Any degree of darkness is just fine. It's not that I even have one that I would necessarily recommend, but just that you test it out beforehand. So this is probably much too light for us to get a strong sort of visible effect out of it. But of course, erring on the side of too light in your dispersion is better than too dark. Because of course you can always add a little bit more ink to it if you want it to be darker. So let's try a second time as well and see what we've got. It's maybe getting a little bit closer to where we want to be. I'm still going to make it just a little bit darker because usually I also make my graphite dispersions a little bit darker as well. let's see. I'm gonna even go a little bit further. So the darker that you go, the more that you're going to include the idea of white chalk in the drawing, or some kind of heightening of the drawing's value, because the white of the paper that's usually serving as the light is being kind of diminished. The interesting thing about it is that it gives you a really beautiful sort of modulated but kind of also even background to kind of work into. So what you would otherwise have to create by adding graphite or charcoal, you already have in this sort of this ink dispersion value. So let's see. I think this is not a bad value to wind up at. Just want to make a nice broad swatch of it. So for me, for my taste, I'd probably tend to keep the tone around this value. Other people will tone their papers a little bit darker. I think that's great. It's just not necessarily my taste. So now that I'm happy with that test strip, I can go ahead and tone half of this paper. Now, when you are toning, there's a couple of things that you want to keep in mind, and they're not necessarily rules, but maybe they're helpful features, right? So when you're going back and forth across the paper, you'd like to keep kind of an even pressure on the brush. This way you're going to get a more even sort of spread of ink across the paper. Also, there's a kind of a sweet spot in terms of the wetness of the brush that you get it onto the paper. What you want to avoid is a kind of a streaky sense that you get when the brush is not wet enough, right, or not saturated enough with your dispersion. Also, if it's too wet and you're getting this sopping pools everywhere, so you're going to want to do this, rehearse this a few times before you go into making one of these papers that you're really ready to use for kind of fine art purposes. You might see that I make a mistake here. Hopefully I can correct it, but if I'm lucky, I'll get just the right amount of sort of moisture in this brush. So let's try that. So I feel like that's a pretty good saturation. You can see there's not a lot of like sort of brush strokes or streakiness remaining. There are some moments at the edge, like here, where I wasn't getting saturated all the way out to the edge. But this is, I think, a pretty good dispersion. And I'm going over each one of these a few times, just so I want to make sure that the value is as even as possible. Now this water is going to kind of settle as it sits on the paper for a while. So I can account for that in terms of the amount of water or evenness that I feel like I'm looking for. Also, I'm going to go up to this edge here so that I have a kind of clean edge to look at against the graphite dispersion. This is why you don't point with your brush. So here we have 1/2 toned in ink. The interesting thing also is that if you go over with successive layers of ink, you can always get a little bit darker, which is another reason why I tend to err on the side of being a little bit too light with my ink dispersions, as I always feel like I'm capable. It's very easy to sort of go over with another layer once this one's dry. I'm going to let this dry, then we're going to do a graphite dispersion on the other side. So now that this side is dry enough, you might even be able still to see there's a little bit of buckle to the paper, a little bit of warp happening on this side. I do feel like it's dry enough that if I put my graphite dispersion next to it, I'm not going to have a difficulty with those sort of bleeding over into each other. And I'm going to mix up now my graphite dispersion. There's plenty of graphite at the bottom of this cup that I just need to kind of stir up. So I'm going to add an amount of water, and I'm going to test out with my brush and just see how much graphite I have in there, how dark a tone I'm able to make just by using what's already in this cup. Of course, if you don't have a gross graphite cup hanging around your studio already, you're going to want to spoon in a little bit of that graphite powder to start out your mixture. So let's see what we have here. Wow, that's a really, really dark mixture. Also a little bit inconsistent. You can see that the graphite isn't so well dispersed in the mixture just yet. It's still a little bit clumpy. So I'm going to add a little bit more water to kind of soften the contrast a little bit more, and kind of continue stirring it around until I feel like I'm able to get a nice, even kind of dispersion of graphite. Again, I usually wouldn't do this so close to the paper that I'm going to be painting it onto, but for the sake of this video, maybe I have to keep it a little bit closer so you can see what's going on. So let's see what we have here. This is not bad. If I look at one of these and the other, I can see that probably I have a fairly similar value. So I'm going to move ahead with that and just see eventually what the outcome is after I've sort of toned the rest of this paper. So let's start. So I think my mixture here is probably a little bit darker than what my ink dispersion was. I'm okay with that, also because the graphite's a little bit, quite a bit reversible, so I'm going to be able to erase away whatever graphite I don't want on this paper. And I'm going to overlap the ink just a little bit. I'm also brushing over this quite a bit to make sure I get kind of an even toning. The graphite won't sort of self-disperse maybe as easily as, say, the ink will. You can see that as this is dried, we've got a really nice kind of even value, maybe with a little bit of gradient, a little bit of sort of darkness in some spots. But overall, when you look at the value of this block, it's in a place where it's mostly unified and there's a tiny bit of variety. And I think that variety actually is very important. It's what actually makes the surface that you're drawing on really kind of interesting to draw on. So I'm going to wait for this one to dry completely, then we're going to do a little bit of an erasure test. After that, I'm going to go into dry toning as well. So here we are. We have the two sides of the paper already toned. It's nice and dry, so it's returned to its sort of quite flat state. We have the ink on one side, we have the graphite dispersion on the other side, and we have a little bit of a Venn diagram overlap in between the two in the middle. The graphite turned out a little bit darker than what the ink did, which I was kind of expecting, but so here we are. And I've got my kneaded rubber eraser, and I just want to do a little bit of an erasure test here to show you maybe how the difference kind of in between these two tones. And I'm going to go just directly in the middle here and start to erase away. Of course, what you also see is that the ink has created a kind of a permanent dye in this section on this side here, and that I'm able to sort of erase away a little bit the graphite on the other side, though it does stick into the paper quite a bit, and I'm going to bring another sheet of white paper by this to show you also how much of the white of the paper we've sacrificed by sort of toning this with graphite dispersed in water. In this instance, with the paper maybe this dark, I would probably choose to heighten the highlights just a little bit with white chalk to kind of bring back some of the luminosity in those areas. So this is a pure gleaming white sheet of paper that you can see next to the two different tones here. And you can see how much of a loss of light that we have on this side with the graphite dispersed in water. Again, it's not a bad thing to lose that. It's just that you need to compensate then also with by using white chalk. I used to do aqueous dispersions a lot more just because I kind of liked some of the effects that I could get, some of the surface that was created rather than dry toning, at least just the appearance of it. But I probably have done it a lot less now, just because I prefer that glow of the paper to come through a little bit more easily. Something that you can also do if you are drawing with your paper adhered to a board in the way that I've done it here, is you can actually paint on specific areas. You don't need to do just a wash all over. So if you had, say, the head of a model through here and you wanted to paint in the background with graphite, you could do that while still preserving the light of the face with sort of white paper, unaffected by the application of an aqueous dispersion. The next toning example that I'm going to make is on a Danish paper. It's the play cut paper that I told you about from Sweden, and you can see that I've just taped it down with a couple pieces of masking tape. Since we're not using any water in this toning process, the paper's not really going to react to anything, so we don't actually need to hold it down with any degree of what's the word? We don't have to hold it down excessively. What we do have is a bit of the Cretacolor pre-ground graphite powder, a paper towel, and you'll notice also I'm wearing a glove. I don't know other artists that necessarily do this, but I oftentimes wear a glove when I'm drawing. Partly because I don't want the oils of my hand getting onto the paper, but also because I tend to use a lot of graphite and a lot of different materials, and I like to keep them off my hands as much as possible. You can see that I have used this glove a lot, and so I'm actually in need of a new pair, but I've only been able to find this exact make in Sweden, so I have to kind of go back there and pick some up at the hardware store. It's a polyurethane dipped glove, and it's mesh backed, as you can see, so my hand doesn't sweat inside of it. But the polyurethane on these particular gloves, this model of glove, is so incredibly thin that I don't lose the kind of dexterity that I have, or the feeling that I have for the pencil that I'm holding. So that's why I use this particular one. So I've got my powdered graphite. I'm going to open it up and just tap a little bit, some powder into the middle of this paper. Now, what you'll find eventually in doing this is that the value of the overall sort of tone of the paper, it doesn't get necessarily too dark with powdered graphite. I mean, you can add way more graphite and get it a little bit darker, but there's a certain threshold to where it's not going to get, when you're dry toning, it's not going to get like black. Whereas if I'm toning like with an aqueous dispersion, I can put tons of graphite in and get a really thick layer of really dark graphite on the paper if I wanted to. I don't usually want to do that, so it doesn't come up, but just to say the sort of basement for how dark this gets is not as deep as the one with an aqueous dispersion of graphite. So I've got my crumpled up paper towel, and I'm going to start sort of rubbing a circular pattern across the paper. This initial pass is just to get the graphite kind of spread out around, and then we're going to even it out after that. Now we have a reasonable tone on the paper. For me, this is probably not quite dark enough, so I'm going to add just a little bit more graphite to see if I can get a tone on the paper that is a little bit darker. So for me, this is a pretty reasonable tone that I would work into. And much like the ink tone that I just showed you, you will see that there is a little bit of variation in the value throughout the paper. It's not perfectly even. I actually find that to be kind of nice. If my working surface is a little bit too pristine, sometimes, you know, I can get caught up in trying to be a little bit too safe with my drawing. So if I have a little bit of controlled chaos to start out with, I feel like it encourages me to be free when kind of working on it. Okay. So I just thought I would show also with this dry toning how erasable it is. I've got my kneaded eraser out here, and I'm just gonna maybe start at the edge and just start taking away some of the graphite. Now, what you can notice here, there is a little bit of graphite left over in the paper, and I'm going to put this paper next to it so you can see that even with a dry tone, you're not going to be able to get back to the exact same lightness of paper. You're going to sacrifice a little bit of value. Now, the darker you make that initial dry tone, the more of that light value that you're going to lose. To the extent that you might even think of incorporating a little bit of white chalk if this sort of residual tone is a little bit too dark to allow kind of the luminosity to come through in the lighter areas of your drawing. So this is just a good example maybe of a kind of triad of values that you can expect to be working with.